the world as will. In 1818, a 30-year-old German philosopher made a claim that would take the world 30 years to take seriously. Beneath everything you see, beneath matter, force, desire, ambition, and life itself, lies one blind, insatiable drive that can never find rest. He called it the will, and he said this: all willing arises from want, therefore from deficiency, and therefore from suffering. 2,000 years before him, a teacher in northern India had said something remarkably similar. He called it tanha, craving. Tonight, we look at what they both found, and at the one place where they went in completely different directions. A difference that matters for your practice. The philosopher's name was Arthur Schopenhauer. He is the only major figure in the Western philosophical tradition who read Buddhist texts, recognized the parallel to his own thought, and welcomed the comparison openly. He formulated his theory of the will first, from Kant and Plato and the Upanishads. Then, decades later, he encountered the Buddhist teachings and found what he had already concluded confirmed by them. He described the agreement as nearly perfect. He was right about the agreement, and he was wrong about the solution. For the next 50 minutes, 3 things. First, what the will is, and why Schopenhauer believed he had found the root of all suffering. Second, what the tradition he admired actually taught, and where the two accounts converge with such precision that the convergence itself is worth pausing over. Third, the one Buddhist distinction that turns his entire solution into the very problem it was meant to solve. Let us begin where he began. Chapter 1. Frankfurt, 1831. A man in his early 40s has moved into a set of rooms on the Schöne Aussicht, overlooking the River Main. He will live there, alone, for the next 29 years. His companions are a series of white poodles, each named Atman. On his writing desk sits a Latin translation of the Upanishads, called the Oupnek'hat. He reads from it every night before sleep. Later, he will write that it has been the consolation of his life, and that it will be the consolation of his death. He is speaking, be it noted, of the Hindu Upanishads. His serious encounter with Buddhist texts is still years away. His name is Arthur Schopenhauer. 13 years earlier, in 1818, he had published a book called The World, as Will and Representation. He had believed, and would continue to believe, that the book contained the solution to the central problem of philosophy, that it said, essentially, everything worth saying about the nature of reality, the source of human suffering, and the possibility of release. Almost no one had read it. The first edition took 16 years to sell out. His lectures at the University of Berlin, which he had scheduled deliberately at the same hour as those of Hegel, then the reigning philosopher of Germany, attracted so few students that they were eventually cancelled. Hegel's hall was full. Schopenhauer's was empty. He would not become famous until he was in his 60s. When fame finally came, in the 1850s, it came suddenly and completely. Wagner sent him a manuscript. Nietzsche discovered him as a student and called him my educator. Tolstoy read him and wept. Freud, without ever citing him by name, absorbed his framework so completely that entire concepts of psychoanalysis are, in effect, Schopenhauer translated into clinical vocabulary. By the time he died in 1860, at the age of 72, the philosopher who had lectured to empty rooms had become the most influential thinker in Europe. What was the idea that took 30 years to be heard? To understand it, we have to go back further. Back to Immanuel Kant, the philosopher whose work Schopenhauer regarded as the greatest achievement in the history of Western thought. Kant had argued, in the late 18th century, that human beings do not perceive reality directly. What we perceive is a construction, a representation shaped by the structure of our own minds. Space, time, causality. These are not features of the world as it is in itself. They are the categories through which our minds organize whatever data reaches us. The world we experience, Kant called it phenomena, appearances. Behind those appearances lies something. Kant called it the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. But that something is, by definition, unknowable. We cannot step outside our own minds to see what is really there. This was the wall that Kant built. And for Schopenhauer, everything depended on what one did at that wall. Schopenhauer accepted Kant's basic architecture. He agreed that space, time, and causality were mental categories, not features of ultimate reality. He agreed that the world that we perceive is representation, Vorstellung, appearance. But then he made a move that no one before him had quite made. He asked, is there really no way to know the thing in itself? Is the wall truly impassable? And he answered, there is one way. There is one point at which each of us has direct access to something that is not merely a representation. That point is our own body. When you raise your arm, you are aware of two things simultaneously. You see the arm rising, that is representation, an image, an appearance. But you also feel the willing from the inside. You feel the drive that lifts it. And the willing, Schopenhauer said, is not a representation. It is the thing in itself, encountered from within. It is what your body is, from the inside. From this single observation, he built the whole of his philosophy. If the willing that we feel in our own bodies is the thing in itself, then everything else, every rock, every tree, every star, every organism, must be the same thing, seen from the outside. The falling of a stone, the growth of a plant, the hunger of an animal, the desire of a human being. These are all expressions of one underlying reality. He called that reality the will. Not a will, not your will or mine, not a conscious will with a purpose, but will as such, blind, insatiable, universal, the single striving that manifests itself in every phenomenon. Listen to his own words. The will, as the thing in itself, constitutes the inner, true, and indestructible nature of man. In itself, it is unconscious, not chosen, not directed, not aiming at anything, just striving. Striving because that is what it is. Gravity, in Schopenhauer's view, is the will of mass to draw itself together. Growth is the will of the organism to extend itself. Sexual desire is the will to perpetuate itself across generations. Your hunger, your ambition, your falling in love, your fear of death, all the same blind drive wearing different faces. The will is one. What appears as many is representation. What is really there is one thing, wanting. And here is where the philosophy turns dark. Because if the will is what everything is, and if the will is nothing but striving, then striving is the fundamental fact about existence. And striving, Schopenhauer argued, is suffering. His argument runs like this. To will something is to want something you do not have. To want something you do not have is to be, in that moment, in a state of lack. Lack is a form of deficiency, and deficiency is felt. It is felt as discomfort, unease, longing, tension. He puts it in a single sentence. All willing arises from want, therefore from deficiency, and therefore from suffering. Now, one might respond, yes, but wanting can be satisfied. You want water, you drink. You no longer want water. The wanting ends. And in the interval between drinking and wanting again, surely there is peace. Schopenhauer's response cuts deep. The satisfaction, he says, is only ever the momentary ending of one particular want. It is not the ending of wanting, because as soon as one want is satisfied, another arises. You drink, now you are hungry. You eat, now you are bored. You find someone to love, now you are afraid of losing them. The will does not rest. It cannot rest. To rest would be to cease to be the will. So life, seen from inside, is not a series of satisfactions punctuated by occasional disappointments. It is a continuous state of wanting, briefly interrupted by momentary satisfactions that immediately give rise to new wants. And when the wanting temporarily runs out, when there is for a moment nothing pressing to want, what fills the space? Boredom. That peculiar suffering that arises when the will has no object to grip. The pain of having wanted something all one's life, achieved it, and discovering that the achievement produced only a brief pleasure followed by the empty question, what next? He writes, thus it oscillates hither and thither between pain and boredom, and these two are in fact the ultimate constituents of it. The pendulum, not a metaphor, a structural description of consciousness. When you want something, you suffer from wanting it. When you get it, the wanting subsides briefly, and boredom fills the gap. So you find something new to want, and you suffer from that, and the pendulum swings. He offers one more formulation, more literary than philosophical, but hard to forget once heard. The life of every individual, viewed as a whole and in general, and taken only in its most significant features, is really always a tragedy, but gone through in detail it has the character of a comedy. Tragedy from a distance, comedy up close, both all the way down. He was describing something. He was describing something anyone who has ever wanted anything recognizes. And this is important to notice, because the sensation of recognition is what makes Schopenhauer so persuasive. He is not making an abstract argument. He is naming a phenomenon that most of us have felt but rarely articulated. The sense that even when things go well, something is missing. That satisfactions are shorter than we expect them to be. That the achievement of goals does not bring the peace we imagined it would. That the wanting is always somehow one step ahead of the having. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that most accounts of Schopenhauer either skip or blur. So let us be careful with it. Schopenhauer formulated all of this: the will, the pendulum, the identification of wanting with suffering, before he had read a single Buddhist text. In 1818, when The World as Will and Representation was published, the serious European study of Buddhism had not yet begun. The word Buddhism had barely entered European languages. The Pali Canon was known to almost no one outside of Sri Lanka and Burma. What Schopenhauer had access to in his 20s was Kant, Plato, and the Latin Oupnek'hat, an 18th century translation of the Persian translation of the Hindu Upanishads. That is where his non-Western influences came from. The Upanishads, not the Suttas. Vedanta, not Dhamma. His first serious encounter with Buddhist thought came later. Around 1836, he read Abel Rémusat's account of the Chinese pilgrim Faxian's journey through Buddhist India. In 1844, he read Eugène Burnouf's Introduction à l'histoire du bouddhisme indien, the book that, more than any other, opened Buddhist studies to 19th century Europe. He continued reading, in the 1850s, whatever new work appeared, including Karl Köppen's early history of Buddhism. The chronology matters. He did not read the Buddha and think, this is what I have been trying to say. He worked out what he had been trying to say from within the Western tradition. Then he encountered the Buddhist material, and then he said, in effect, "They have said this too." He described the discovery as a confirmation. He wrote that if the reader had also received the benefit of the Vedas, that is, the Upanishads, the reader would be the better prepared for what he had to say. And if, on top of that, the reader was acquainted with Buddhism, so much the better. This is the historical order. It is worth stating clearly, because it changes how we read the parallel. Schopenhauer is not a Western philosopher who borrowed from Buddhism. He is a Western philosopher who arrived at conclusions of his own, and then found, when he looked east, that others had arrived at conclusions structurally similar. And here we have to be honest about a further detail, because the parallel he was so pleased to find was, in one respect, not quite what he thought it was. Schopenhauer, working with the limited European scholarship of his time, tended to blur the distinction between Buddhist and Vedantic teaching. He treated nirvana as if it were essentially the same as the Upanishadic dissolution of the individual self into Brahman, as if the Buddhist goal were a cosmic merger, the drop returning to the ocean. This is a misreading. The Buddhist tradition does not teach dissolution into a cosmic self. It teaches the cessation of a particular process, the process of craving-driven becoming, and the realization of what the tradition calls, in the discourse we will look at later, the unborn, the unfabricated, the unmade. When Schopenhauer writes nirvana, he often means something closer to what the Hindu tradition calls moksha, liberation as merger. The confusion is understandable for a 19th century European working with fragmentary translations. But for what we are going to look at tonight, it matters, because the place where his reading of the Buddhist destination diverges from what the Buddhist tradition actually teaches is not incidental. It is exactly the place where his solution to suffering begins to run into trouble. That trouble is what the next hour is about. But before we get to the trouble, we have to see the convergence clearly, because it is real, and it is more precise than most parallels between Western and Eastern thought turn out to be. The next chapter looks at what these two figures, separated by 2,000 years and half a world, actually agreed about, and where the Buddha's analysis places Schopenhauer's will inside a larger philosophical map. To that we now turn. Chapter 2. Around 528 BCE, the traditional date is uncertain and probably too early, but the tradition matters less here than the teaching. A wanderer stood before a small group of his former companions in a deer park at Isipatana, near Benares. He had spent 6 years, by his own account, in extreme asceticism. He had almost died of it. He had abandoned it, and having abandoned it, he claimed to have found what he had been looking for. This was his first public teaching. It contained what would become known as the Four Noble Truths, the 4 observations that structure everything the tradition would say for the next 25 centuries. The second of those truths is the one we need tonight. In the standard rendering by Thanissaro Bhikkhu of the discourse called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the discourse that sets the wheel of Dhamma in motion, the Buddha names the origin of suffering this way. It is, he says, the craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there. That is, craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. S. 56.11. The Pali word translated as craving is tanha. Literally, it means thirst, not preference, not desire in the ordinary English sense of, I would like that, something more urgent. the pull that arises before you have chosen it, that operates whether or not you approve of it, that turns wanting into a kind of felt lack. Tanha is the mind reaching for what it does not have, reaching and reaching again, and finding that the reaching itself does not stop when the object is grasped. Now hear that alongside Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer wrote, "All willing arises from want, therefore from deficiency, and therefore from suffering." The Buddha said, "Tanha is the origin of dukkha." Schopenhauer wrote that consciousness oscillates between pain and boredom. That satisfaction is only the momentary silencing of a want that will immediately be replaced. The Buddha said that tanha, having grasped one thing, relishes now here and now there, moves on, seeks the next, does not rest. The convergence is not incidental. It is not just that both traditions notice that people want things and are unhappy. Almost every reflective tradition notices that. What Schopenhauer and the Buddha share is more specific. They both identify a particular feature of wanting itself, its internal structure, independent of what it happens to want, as the source of the trouble. They both notice that satisfying wants does not end wanting. They both notice that the deepest suffering is not the failure to get what one desires, but the discovery that getting what one desires does not stop the machinery of desiring. They both trace the problem to the same layer. Let us name the convergences precisely. There are 5 worth stating. First, both identify a blind structural process, not a moral failure, not a personal weakness, not a cultural mistake, as the root of suffering. The will, in Schopenhauer, is not something you have. It is what you are. Tanha, in the Buddha's analysis, is not a flaw in your character. It is a conditioned process that arises whenever the conditions for its arising are present. Neither is a matter of blame. Both are structural. Second, both notice that the drive creates its own suffering, independent of external circumstances. The will suffers because the will wants. It would suffer even if it always got what it wanted, because the wanting itself is the deficiency. Tanha gives rise to dukkha, whether the craved object is obtained or not, because tanha, in its reaching, is already a kind of contraction, a state of the mind not being at rest with what is. Third, both diagnose the pattern of relief and return. Schopenhauer's pendulum, pain, satisfaction, boredom, new want, pain again, is very close in shape to what the Buddha describes when he says tanha relishes now here and now there. The satisfying of one craving is not the end of craving. It is the pause before the next craving arises. Both traditions notice this pause. Both refuse to mistake it for peace. Fourth, both place compassion at the center of the ethical response. This is worth pausing over because it is often overlooked. Schopenhauer wrote a book called On the Basis of Morality, in which he argued that the one genuine ethical motivation is Mitleid, a German word usually translated as compassion, but literally meaning suffering with. His reasoning is metaphysical. If the will is one, then your suffering and mine are the same will suffering from itself. To recognize this, to feel in another's pain that it is not other, is to see through the illusion of separateness that the world of representation projects. Compassion, for Schopenhauer, is the moment in which one will recognizes itself in another. The Buddhist tradition also places compassion, karuna, along with loving kindness and sympathetic joy and equanimity, at the ethical center. The Buddhist route is different, not the unity of a cosmic will, but the recognition, through direct investigation, that the self one takes to be doing the willing is itself a construction, that there is no fixed boundary between my suffering and yours, because there is no fixed my in the first place. Different metaphysics, similar ethical destination, and that the two traditions arrive at compassion by such different routes suggests that compassion itself is not incidental, that it is what falls out one way or another when the illusion of separate selfhood begins to loosen. Fifth, and finally, both point towards some state beyond willing. Schopenhauer, in the last section of The World as Will and Representation, the section where he speaks of what he calls the denial of the will, writes a passage that has troubled and fascinated readers for 2 centuries. We freely acknowledge, he writes, that what remains after the entire abolition of will is for all those who are still full of will certainly nothing. But conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and has denied itself, this our world, which is so very real, with all its suns and Milky Ways, is nothing. He is speaking of what he calls, borrowing the word, nirvana. And though his understanding of what that word means is, as we have seen, tangled with Vedantic assumptions, the intuition behind the passage, that there is a state that appears as nothing from the perspective of wanting, but is not nothing in itself, is a real intuition. It is close, though not identical, to what a certain Buddhist discourse describes when it speaks of the unborn, the unbecome, the unmade, the unfabricated. We will come to that discourse. So, 5 convergences, real, precise, worth naming. Schopenhauer was not merely projecting his own thought onto the East. He was recognizing something. And when he called the agreement between his philosophy and the Buddhist teaching, in his own phrase, remarkably close, he was on these 5 points correct. But if the convergence is real, the divergence is also real. And the divergence is the interesting part, because it turns out that where Schopenhauer places the will inside his own philosophical map, and where the Buddha places tanha inside his, these are not the same map at all. To see this, we need one more discourse. It is short. It is one of the most philosophically dense passages in the Pali Canon. And it is, I think, the single most illuminating text one can hold up next to Schopenhauer. It is called the Kakayanagotta Sutta, SN 12.15. In it, a monk named Kakayana comes to the Buddha and asks about right view, about what constitutes seeing correctly, and the Buddha answers with an unusual philosophical precision. In Thanissaro's rendering, everything exists. That is one extreme. Nothing exists. That is a second extreme. Without veering toward either of these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma by the middle. This is the philosophical center of what the tradition calls the middle way. Not, in this instance, the middle between sensual indulgence and self-mortification. That is a different application of the same principle. Here, the middle is between 2 metaphysical claims. On one side, the claim that there is a substantial, enduring reality underlying all appearances, some real thing that stands behind and produces the world. On the other side, the claim that there is nothing at all, that all is illusion, that phenomena arise from and return to sheer nothingness. The Buddha rejects both, and he does not reject them for lack of interest. He rejects them because he thinks both are misreadings of experience, and because both, when taken as guides for practice, lead somewhere the practitioner does not want to go. Now hold Schopenhauer up to that framework. Schopenhauer's will is quite explicitly a metaphysical claim of the first kind. The will is what really exists. Everything that appears, every object, every event, every person, is a manifestation of one underlying reality. The will is the substance. Phenomena are its expressions. When you strip away appearance, what remains is the will, and the will is one, and the will is real. In the language of the Kaccayanagotta Sutta, this is everything exists, the pole of substance, of a real thing underlying appearances. Schopenhauer's whole system depends on it. Without the will as thing in itself, his philosophy collapses back into Kant's agnosticism about ultimate reality. But then, look at what Schopenhauer says about the solution. He calls it Willensverneinung, the denial of the will. He describes it as the will turning against itself, refusing itself, negating itself. And he describes what remains, from the perspective of one who still wills, as nothing. In his most famous formulation, he says the world with all its suns and Milky Ways is, to one who has denied the will, nothing. What is he doing here, philosophically? He is pointing his solution toward the other pole, toward the annihilation of what really exists, toward nothing exists as the endpoint. He does not quite arrive there. He leaves open the possibility that what appears as nothing might be, from the other side, something. But the trajectory is unmistakable. His diagnosis identifies a cosmic substance. His cure aims at its annihilation. So Schopenhauer's philosophy has this structure. It posits a substantial reality, the will, and then seeks its cessation. It is, in the framework of the Kaccayanagotta Sutta, a movement from one extreme toward the other, from everything exists toward nothing exists, from cosmic monism toward cosmic annihilation. And that trajectory, that particular philosophical shape, is exactly what the Buddha, in this discourse, marks as an extreme to be avoided. The middle way does not do this. The middle way does not posit a substantial will and then try to end it. The middle way does not claim that there is a real thing underlying appearances and then aim its practice at the abolition of that thing. Instead, and this is the delicate point, the middle way begins by noticing that the question is wrongly framed. There is no cosmic will to abolish. There is only a flow of conditioned processes, arising in dependence on other processes, ceasing when their conditions cease. Tanha, in this analysis, is not a metaphysical substance. It is a process. It arises when certain conditions arise. It does not arise when those conditions do not arise. The question is not, how do we annihilate the will? The question is, what are the conditions for the arising of craving? And can those conditions be met in a way that does not produce craving? This is a very different philosophical shape, and it produces a very different practice. Now here is where the difference is not just theoretical. It touches something Schopenhauer himself lived through, though from the outside, not the inside, and something the Buddha himself lived through on the inside before his teaching began. Schopenhauer's ideal, in the last sections of his major work, was the ascetic saint, the person who has renounced the world, denied the flesh, refused all satisfactions. He looked with reverence at Christian mystics, at Hindu renunciants, at what he understood, inaccurately, but in this case, the inaccuracy matters less. As the Buddhist monk, the path to liberation, he thought, ran through the systematic starving of the will. Refuse it what it wants. Deny it its objects. Let it, over time, exhaust itself and fall silent. The Buddha had tried exactly this. Before his awakening, before he was called the Buddha at all, when he was still the young Siddhartha Gautama, having left his family and his palace to seek liberation. He spent 6 years in the most extreme austerities the Indian tradition of his time knew how to teach. He ate almost nothing. He held his breath. He slept on beds of thorns. His body was reduced to skin over bone. The tradition tells us that when he touched his belly, he could feel his spine, And then, in the discourse called the Mahasacaka Sutta, MN 36, he tells us what he concluded from that. In Thanisaro's rendering, whatever Brahmins or contemplatives in the past have experienced painful, racking, piercing feelings due to self-torment, this is the utmost. There is nothing better than this. Whatever Brahmins or contemplatives in the future will experience painful, racking, piercing feelings due to self-torment, this is the utmost. There is nothing better than this. But with this racking practice of austerities, I haven't attained any superior human state, any distinction in knowledge or vision worthy of the noble ones. Might there be another path to awakening? He is speaking with a very specific philosophical claim. He is not saying that asceticism is inadequate because his particular version of it was not extreme enough. He is saying that this whole approach, the systematic starving of desire, the punishment of the body, the assault on wanting, is a dead end. Not because it is too hard, because it is aimed in the wrong direction. And what did he do? The tradition tells us that he remembered in that moment a memory from his childhood. He had been sitting under a rose apple tree while his father performed a ceremony. He had entered, spontaneously, a state of deep meditative absorption, pleasant, luminous, quiet. And he asked himself, in that later moment of exhaustion after the years of self-mortification, why am I afraid of that pleasure that has nothing to do with sensuality and unskillful mental qualities? He was not afraid of it, he concluded, because such pleasure was in fact part of the path. He accepted food. He recovered his strength. He sat down under a tree. And then, according to the tradition, he understood. The philosophical point is this. The Buddha, from the inside of his own experience, rejected exactly the approach that Schopenhauer, from the outside, was recommending. The Buddha tried the systematic denial of desire and found it did not lead to liberation. It led, at best, to the destruction of the body. And the reason it did not lead to liberation was not incidental, it was structural. Because, and this is what the next chapter will develop, the attempt to end desire by an act of will is itself a desire. The attempt to negate the will is itself a movement of will. Schopenhauer's Willensverneinung has, within it, a hidden circularity that the Buddha diagnosed 25 centuries earlier. This is not, let me be clear, a matter of one tradition being right and another wrong. It is a matter of one tradition having tried something and found it inadequate, and another tradition arriving at the same recommendation without ever having tried it. Schopenhauer was reading, in his study in Frankfurt, about ascetic saints, reading with reverence, but reading. He was not a practitioner of asceticism. He lived a life of considerable bourgeois comfort. He kept his poodle, ate his meals at the same restaurant, went to concerts. His endorsement of will denial was philosophical. His life was not, which is not a criticism. It is only to notice that the assessment he offered was the assessment of someone who had thought about the path, not of someone who had walked it. The Buddha's assessment came from having walked it to its end, and having concluded that it did not go where he had hoped it would go. So we have now the shape of the divergence. On one side, a philosophy that posits a substantial cosmic will and recommends its systematic denial. On the other side, a teaching that refuses the metaphysical posit in the first place, that treats craving as a conditioned process rather than a cosmic substance, and that rejects ascetic denial as a dead end. Same phenomenology of suffering, different metaphysics, different practice, but we have not yet reached the sharpest point. The sharpest point is a specific analytic move, a distinction that the Buddha made in the very same discourse where he named tanha as the origin of suffering. that speaks with startling directness to what Schopenhauer proposed. It is a distinction that most Western readers of the Second Noble Truth pass over quickly. It is easy to miss, but once seen, it changes the reading of Schopenhauer's whole solution. To that distinction, we now turn. Chapter 3. Recall the Buddha's formulation of the origin of suffering from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Craving, he said, comes in three forms. Craving for sensuality, the reaching for pleasant experience. Craving for becoming, the reaching to be, to continue, to persist, to become someone. And then third, and this is the one that matters here, craving for non-becoming. In Pali, vibhava tanha, the craving for non-existence, the wanting to not be. Read that again, because it is precise, and because it is the sharpest thing the Buddha said that speaks to Schopenhauer's solution, and because it is very easy to hear it once and let it pass. The Buddha, in the discourse in which he first named the origin of suffering, listed three forms that origin takes. The third is the craving to not exist, the desire for cessation, the wanting that seeks its own annihilation, and the annihilation of what it is embedded in, as its object. Now, what is Schopenhauer's Willensverneinung, his denial of the will, if not this? What is the ascetic's systematic starving of desire, if not this? What is the trajectory of any philosophy or practice that identifies wanting as the problem and aims at the abolition of wanting as the cure, if not exactly what the Buddha named in his very first public teaching as vibhava tanha? Notice what has happened, philosophically. Schopenhauer identifies the will as the source of suffering. He proposes to end suffering by ending the will. But ending the will is itself an object of desire, the desire for the will to end. So the ending of desire, in his framework, requires the presence of a certain desire, the desire for the ending. And that desire, the wanting for wanting to cease, is itself a form of the very thing it is trying to negate. Schopenhauer's solution contains, at its root, the problem it was meant to solve. The Buddhist tradition has a name for this. It is vibhava tanha, and it is one of the three forms of the very craving that constitutes the origin of suffering. I want to be careful with this observation, because it can sound, if delivered without care, like a debater's move, like the point at which one tradition scores against another. That is not what it is. It is not a Buddhist victory over a Western thinker. It is a specific analytical observation the Buddhist tradition makes about a certain kind of solution, a solution that appears in many traditions, not only in Schopenhauer's. Jain asceticism, certain forms of Christian mysticism that seek the annihilation of the self before God, certain philosophies of renunciation across many cultures. Anywhere the solution to suffering takes the shape of the systematic negation of what is felt as the problem. Anywhere the recommendation is that we must unwant ourselves into freedom. The same structural difficulty appears. The Buddhist analysis names it, and it names it not in triumph, but in diagnosis. This is what happens, the tradition says, when a certain kind of solution is attempted. This is where it lands. So, not Buddhism beating Schopenhauer. Buddhism naming a structural feature of a certain class of solutions to which Schopenhauer's belongs. But if that is the diagnosis, what is the alternative? If we cannot end suffering by willing the willing to end, if that just makes more willing, what can we do? Here, the Buddhist analysis becomes practical, and it becomes specific. Because it does not just say, don't try to negate craving. It says, look at how craving actually arises, and in looking, the possibility of not producing it emerges. The tradition offers a sequence, a series of conditions that describes how craving comes to be. It begins with contact, the meeting of a sense faculty with its object. The eye meets a form, the ear meets a sound, the mind meets a thought. In Pali, this is called phassa, contact. From contact, feeling arises. In Pali Vedana, something is registered as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The registration is not chosen, it is immediate. And then, from feeling, if the process is left unexamined, craving arises. Tanha, the reaching, the pull toward what was pleasant, the pull away from what was unpleasant, the pull towards some resolution of what was neutral. Contact, feeling, craving. 3 steps, not 2. There is a step between what happens to us and how we crave in response to it. And that step is where the whole practical program of the Buddhist path takes place. Because if craving arises from feeling, then the point at which craving can be interrupted is not the craving itself. You cannot uncrave once craving has arisen. That is the trap Schopenhauer stepped into. But the point at which feeling has arisen and craving has not yet appeared. In that gap, if the mind is trained to notice, something else becomes possible. Not the suppression of craving, not the willing against willing that recapitulates vibhava tanha. Something quieter, the seeing of feeling as feeling, the recognition that pleasant is pleasant, unpleasant is unpleasant, and neither requires the reaching that ordinarily follows. The recognition that the reaching is not you. It is a process. It arises from conditions. When the conditions are seen clearly, the process does not have to complete itself. This is what the tradition calls vipassana, usually translated as insight, though the Pali literally means something closer to seeing through or seeing into. It is not the willing of anything. It is the trained attention that watches how the mind actually works, moment by moment. And in watching, without willing, the mechanism that produces craving is exposed. And in being exposed, it becomes possible for it to arise less. Not because it has been forced not to, because the conditions for its arising have been seen through. Notice how different this is from Schopenhauer's picture. Schopenhauer says, the will is what you are. Deny it. The Buddha says, craving is a process that arises when certain conditions are present. Watch the conditions. Schopenhauer's practice is a war against the self. The Buddha's practice is a slow, patient, unglamorous act of seeing. And here is what emerges from that seeing. Not the extinction of a cosmic will, not the drop dissolving into the ocean. Something the Buddha describes in a very short discourse called the Udana, the Book of Inspired Utterances, in words that will sound familiar to anyone who has read Schopenhauer's passage about the world, with all its suns and Milky Ways being nothing. Here is how the Buddha puts it, again in Thanisaro's rendering. There is, monks, an unborn, unfabricated, unmade, unconditioned. If there were not that unborn, unfabricated, unmade, unconditioned, there would not be the case that escape from the born, fabricated, made, conditioned would be discerned. UD 8.3. That is a positive statement. It is not the description of nothing. It is the description of something the Buddha insists is real, though it cannot be named in the ordinary vocabulary of phenomena. The unborn, the unfabricated, not a substance behind appearances. The Kaccayanagotta Sutta forbids that reading. Not a nothingness either. That is what unborn specifically rules out. Something else. Something the tradition points at rather than describes, because description in the language of what is born and fabricated cannot reach it. Schopenhauer, in his own way, was reaching for something like this. His passage about the world being nothing to those in whom the will has turned is a gesture in this direction. But he reaches it from the wrong side. He reaches it as negation. From inside the world of willing, he can only describe it as what is left when willing is denied. The Buddhist tradition, having a different practice, describes it not as what is left after negation, but as what is discerned when the mechanism of craving is seen through, not the abolition of what really exists. The unfabricated, which was there all along, obscured by the fabrications the mind was producing. The philosophical shape is different, and the practice is different, and the destination therefore is not the same destination, even though from Schopenhauer's side of the wall, the description sounds similar. Now, one more thing needs to be said, because it belongs to the history of ideas rather than to the argument itself, and because it changes how we should think about Schopenhauer's place in Western thought. For all his imprecisions about Buddhism, Schopenhauer did something no one before him had done in Western philosophy. He transmitted into the German philosophical vocabulary of the 19th century a set of intuitions and structural insights that had originated, in their sharpest form, in the Indian ascetic and contemplative traditions. He did this using Kantian metaphysics, Platonic idealism, and prose that his European contemporaries could actually read. And once those intuitions were in the Western tradition, dressed in a vocabulary Europeans could handle, other Western thinkers responded to them. Nietzsche read Schopenhauer as a young man and called him his educator. Then he spent much of his adult life defining himself against Schopenhauer. His doctrine of eternal recurrence, his affirmation of life, his critique of what he called nihilism, are all in significant part responses to Schopenhauer's pessimism. But the vocabulary Nietzsche was arguing with was Schopenhauer's vocabulary, which was, in an indirect way, a Western reworking of Eastern themes. Freud, though he rarely credited Schopenhauer directly, absorbed his framework thoroughly. The Freudian id, the it, the impersonal drive that operates beneath consciousness and produces the phenomena we take to be our chosen desires, is, in its structure, Schopenhauer's will translated into clinical language. The death drive, thanatos, is Willensverneinung biologized. Wittgenstein, later, read Schopenhauer carefully and let him inform the ethical and mystical concluding passages of the Tractatus. The famous propositions about what cannot be said, what can only be shown, what lies at the edge of the ciable, carry, in their sensibility, a Schopenhauerian quality that traces back through Schopenhauer to something older. So a certain set of insights, first articulated in the language of Indian contemplative traditions, entered European philosophy through Schopenhauer's Kantian, an idealist reformulation, and shaped the next 150 years of Western thought, even where those who inherited them did not know the ultimate source, and even where Schopenhauer himself had, on certain points, misunderstood what he was transmitting. That is not a small thing. That is the work of a relay station. He passed the signal on. The signal was imperfect at his end. The receivers took it, argued with it, built on it, and produced their own systems in response. This is how ideas move through history. Not always by accurate transmission, sometimes by imperfect transmission that provokes the next generation to work out what was really being pointed at, which is what we have tried to do tonight. Not to correct Schopenhauer against the Buddha, as if the Buddha were a scoring rubric, but to hear what Schopenhauer heard, to see where he was pointing, to notice where his pointer bent under the weight of his own assumptions, and to hold his description up against the description that had come long before him. Not to declare a winner, but to see, with more clarity than Schopenhauer himself could see, what both were reaching for. To that closing observation we now come. close. Schopenhauer, at the end of his life, was still in Frankfurt, still in the same rooms above the Main, still reading the Oupnek'hat before bed. In the additions he made to his later work, he wrote, in effect, that his teaching of the denial of the will agreed, in its essentials, with what he called the Buddhist doctrine of nirvana and with the Vedantic teaching of liberation. He was proud of the agreement. He felt, I think, that in reaching those conclusions from within German philosophy, he had joined a much older conversation and had been welcomed into it by voices he could not hear. He was right that he had joined the conversation. He was wrong about what the other voices were saying. The place where he went wrong is a place he could not have seen, because the will, in his description of it, cannot see itself. That is its nature. It is blind. It strives without knowing that it is striving. It cannot step outside itself to observe its own working. And so any solution the will proposes to its own suffering will be a solution proposed from within the very condition it is trying to leave. It will be more willing to unwill, the wanting for wanting to cease, which is, in the vocabulary of the tradition Schopenhauer admired, precisely the third form of the origin of suffering. What the tradition he admired actually contained was not another theory. It was a practice, a trained attention that watches the arising of craving in the body, in the breath, in the half-second between the meeting of the eye with the form and the reaching of the mind for what it has seen. Not another idea about the will, a way of looking at wanting as it happens, slow, repeated, unglamorous, without any war against anything. He spent a lifetime wanting the will to end. The path he thought he was pointing at suggests something different. Look at the wanting. Watch it arise. Watch it pass. Watch it not be you. Not because you have decided it is not you, the deciding is more wanting, but because, in the watching, it becomes clear that it never was. There is a process. The process arises. The process ceases. There is no one behind it who needs to negate it. There is only the process and the seeing of the process, and, as the seeing deepens, the growing quiet that comes when a process is no longer taken for a self. Schopenhauer heard the far end of that. He described what he heard as the world with all its suns and Milky Ways being nothing. From where he stood, in the middle of the will, it could only appear that way. But from where the Buddha was pointing, it was not nothing. It was the unfabricated, waiting to be discerned. Thank you for listening.